Now, the Sunday Times leads today with a story, and it's one the Tory party just do not appear to be able to shake off. The headline reads, "New Tory sleaze row as donors who pay $3 million get a seat in the House of Lords." Well, this, of course, comes hard on the heels of the interview we did here last Sunday with Owen Paterson. It was the only broadcast interview that Mr. Paterson did. I spoke to him at length. We debated afterwards what he'd said. And little did we know, within 48 hours, what this would turn into. Paul Embry, he talked, didn't he, about milk safety. This is what he pushed very, very hard. I did wonder later whether perhaps it was what he didn't say to us that was perhaps more relevant.
I think he was slightly economical with you last week. He gave the impression that it was simply about the exemption. He raised the issue of antibiotics in milk, and that was the exemption that allowed him to raise that on behalf of a company who were paying him money. In fact, when you read the report, it was quite a bit more than that, wasn't it? It was meeting with ministers, it was promoting the products and the technology of Randox, one of the companies.
Yeah, there was a blood product.
Yeah, and also with
well.
The other company he was being paid by, Lynn Country Foods, he lobbied ministers to try to put a competitor at a disadvantage in terms of food labelling. So, yeah, I think it was as much about what he didn't tell you as what he did tell you. I mean, I certainly think he had some legitimate concerns about the fact that, for example, he wasn't allowed to appeal. I think it's a part of natural justice that if you suffer a sanction, having gone through that sort of process, you should be able to appeal, and he's not allowed to do that. But no, I mean, I ultimately, having looked at the report, I don't think the guy can have any complaints. I think he's pretty much bang to rights, to be truthful.
And Arlene, you know, we listened to Owen Paterson, and clearly, you know, Downing Street listened to Owen Paterson as well. It was one of the quickest and most dramatic U-turns by a government. You know, at one moment, they're going to get rid of the current procedure, the current disciplinary procedure, and 24 hours later, it's back to where we started. Arlene, do you think those headlines that scream Tory sleaze, does it actually stick? Because it's gone on, hasn't it already, way beyond Owen Paterson to what the Sunday Times are now saying about seats in the House of Lords.
Well, I think the story last week conflated two issues. There was the individual issue of Owen Paterson, and as you rightly said, he came on our show last week. He talked about the impact it was having on his family and all of the issues he had with the process. So there was that issue. And then there was the issue, which Paul has referred to, of the process itself, the system. Is it fit for purpose? Does it need to be reviewed? Is there a need to look at it again? Because, you know, justice just doesn't need to be done. It needs to be seen to be done. And I think there's enough MPs now that are dissatisfied with the system, and if you don't have a system which is independent and fair in the eyes of those that are being adjudged by the system, then I think there is an issue. So I don't blame the government or Parliament for wanting to look at the system again. I think that is something that should be done. But I think what happened last week was they conflated that with an individual determination of the process, and then the two issues became embroiled, and we've seen some very angry scenes in the House of Commons. People were very cross about the fact that the two issues were being conflated, and actually it got a bit unseemly when I was watching it live, and I noticed that some opposition MPs were actually scoffing at the death of Owen's wife, which I found really, really distasteful. I mean, there's more than one way to bring a House of Commons into disrepute, and frankly, scoffing at the death of someone was certainly not a good look for the House of Commons.
No, that's certainly true. Now, there is a sort of slight déjà vu feeling to all of this, because Tory sleaze was a big headline back in the 1990s. And there was one man who sticks in the memory, who arrived on the scene wearing a white suit, and his name was Martin Bell. And I'm very pleased to say that the former independent MP is with us this morning. Martin, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Tory sleaze, it's all over the front pages, and it's now not just about Owen Paterson, it's about a succession of people who've given the Conservative Party £3 million, gone on to get treasurers' jobs, and now a rather large number of them seem to be sitting in the House of Lords. I just wonder, Martin, you know, after you won that seat in Tatton against Neil Hamilton, and then in 2009 we had the MP's expenses story that came back. Has the problem with money, British politics and sleaze, has it ever really gone away?
It has not entirely gone away. It advances and retreats. But I have a feeling that what we saw last week is worse than what happened in the 1990s in this respect. I served for 3 years on the Standards Committee, and every single conclusion we came to, every penalty recommended was accepted on the floor of the House. What we never saw was a sitting government trying to block what we had decided, and I think that is new and rather alarming. I don't think they'll try it again. But I watched that vote on last Wednesday afternoon. I couldn't believe my eyes. I sometimes think, Nigel, that one of the lessons of history is that we don't learn the lessons of history.
Well, I'm sure that's true. And I suppose, in a way, is this perhaps what happens when a government's got a very big majority? Or is it a Conservative Party? Because, you know, I've had my issues with the Conservative Party over the last few years in terms, for example, of expenditure on elections, by-elections, target general election seats. I mean, my impression, this may be unfair, but my impression is there are some in the upper echelons of the Conservative Party who simply think they're above the law.
I think the problem becomes more acute when you have a government with a large majority. Whatever party it's of. During my time on the committee, there was a Labour government with a huge majority. And a whispering campaign then started up against the excellent independent Commissioner for Standards, Elizabeth Filkin. And if you remember, she was let go. And I think most of that whispering campaign, in my recollection, came from Labour MPs and friends of the accused. It's the way it works across both parties.
Martin, what can we do? I mean, clearly, the British public just don't like their members of Parliament having other sources of income, and particularly if they're company consultants. I mean, clearly, you know, if you run a business and you get elected to Parliament, well, that's fine. You give the day-to-day management to somebody else and you might earn dividends. That's fine. But the idea of an MP becoming a consultant for a commercial company, I mean, if we got rid of that, would it help? Or would that be unfair of people that sit on the backbenches in the House of Commons?
No, I don't think it would be unfair. I think a tightening of the rules on lobbying is very much in order. There's nothing wrong with lobbying. I mean, it's part of politics, as you know. I used to lobby for the salt industry because I had a salt mine in the Tatton constituency, for the pharmaceutical industry because I was the MP for AstraZeneca. It's all right so long as no money changes hands. As soon as money changes hands, then that's corruption.
Yes, I mean, the word corruption, Keir Starmer used the word corruption quite openly this week, and it remains to be seen whether the Labour Party can capitalise on this in the way that Tony Blair did against John Major's government in the run-up to that 1997 general election. More broadly, Martin, have we reached a point, in your view, with the whole system of people being appointed to the House of Lords? Is it time we had major constitutional reform?
Yes, I used to raise this point many times. I thought it took only £1 million to buy a seat in the House of Lords, but you know what inflation is. Now it's 3 million. And I got up in the House one day and said, we might as well have a rate card, so much for an MB, so much for an OB, so much for a knighthood. There is a system. It has all the effectiveness of a chocolate fire guard. I think we have to revisit this and put something in place for the first time that really checks this peculiarly British form of corruption.
Yeah, and finally, Martin, it's been rumoured that you might be dusting off that white suit and having a crack at the by-election in North Shropshire. Is there any truth in this?
Nigel, I'm 83 years old and on a stick, and I think that the fact that he resigned his seat makes it much less compelling. But in extreme circumstances demand extreme remedies. I think you should take a look at Leicester East. If Keith Vaz seeks to return to the House of Commons, then it might be worth looking at.
Interesting. Martin Bell, thank you very much indeed for coming on and joining us this morning. Well, we couldn't have had a better person, really, to come on and talk about this than Martin Bell, could we? Arlene, what did you make of what he had to say?
Well, he may be 83, but he's very clear, and it reminded me of the time that he stood in Tatton and took all of that on. I mean, I think, Nigel, we need a bit of perspective. I mean, not all people who go to the House of Lords, or not all people who are members of Parliament, are doing it for the wrong reasons. That we know very well that most people do it for the right reasons, and they want to bring forward issues for their constituents and for the good of the country, and that's what they do. But when some instances occur, then that's what causes the discussion that we're having here today. But, you know, Leicester East has been mentioned. We're not talking about Claudia Webb. We're not talking about the fact that she was convicted of harassment last week. There's no conversations about her being recalled or resigning her seat. And I think that's wrong. I think she should certainly be leaving the House of Commons, given what happened last week.
Yeah, as you say, that's been completely obscured. Paul, thoughts on what Martin Bell had to say?
Well, on the Claudia Webb thing, I have to say, even as a Labour person, I completely agree. I mean, what she did was appalling. She's been convicted. The honourable thing would be to step down and for there to be a by-election. I think if she clings on to her seat, I think that would be a very sad indictment.
Yes, I mean, for an MP to lose their seat, they have to be convicted for a year and a day.
Yeah, and
it's the old Victorian definition of a felony as opposed to a misdemeanor.
It's a strange one, but in terms of her seat, she's fallen just the right side of the line in terms of being able to stay there. But look, you know, people, and there may be a recall process that people demand that she stands down, but it's a matter of honour. You know, it was a pretty clear-cut case as far as I could see in terms of the court case. She was found to have engaged in the most atrocious behaviour, and I think that somebody who's an MP who is found guilty of that needs to fall on their sword. Whether she will remains to be seen, but she really ought to. But in terms of Martin's point, I think he's absolutely right. I mean, I find it difficult when you're a member of Parliament representing sometimes tens of thousands of constituents. How you have time for a second job anyway? I mean, it seems to me that the parliamentary process and constituency work is in itself a full-time job, and if it's being done properly, you ought to take up.
What is a full-time job?
Well, I would say being an MP is a full-time job.
How many hours a week?
Well, I think if you're doing your job diligently and properly and representing your constituents and meeting with your constituents and lobbying in Parliament on their behalf and taking an interest in the affairs of the nation, whether it's the economy or foreign policy or whatever, I would argue you probably have got a full-time job. And to see MPs, and I'm not saying they're not diligent, but to see MPs going out and being barristers and consultants, I think most of the public look at that and say, well, are you doing your first job?
No, the public feel very strongly about it. But that there's absolutely no doubt at all. I have to say what Martin Bell said about the fact that Owen Paterson will not be standing in this by-election, which he could have been, of course, had there been a recall petition triggered, as he said himself, makes it less compelling. And he's right. We'll see what happens. I have to say, from my own experience of dealing with the British establishment and fighting against the British establishment, I think the word corrupt is perfectly fair, perfectly reasonable. I think the Sunday Times story about £3 million, then working as a treasurer and then going to the House of Lords, I don't think the Sunday Times have even scratched the surface of this. This goes much, much deeper, and it isn't just about people giving money to political parties. Peerages are being used as a means of buying off political opponents, and that's what they tried to do to me in 2019. They literally came along and said, right, you as the Brexit Party can have all of these peerages if you back Boris in the general election. It was the most corrupt, disgraceful thing I've seen in all my years in politics, and yet nobody at the time even seemed vaguely interested. If one good thing does come out of the Owen Paterson saga, perhaps a complete rethink of the whole system, because I really do believe that it is corrupt and there are people in very top positions in this country who are able to act as if they're above the law and get away with it time and time again.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.